Thanks to our panel for being here. We have Steph McAfee. She's from up at UNR. She's the Nevada State Climatologist. Catherine Magee is also from up at UNR. She's the director of the Nevada Historical Society. Bill Fox joins us from the Nevada Museum of Art with a title that I can't quite remember accurately. So, and Laura Jackson is our conductor, of course. Chris Morrison is going to be the moderator of the discussion. And we also have Jimmy López Bellido, who's the composer of the piece. He's joining us online. So we'll see him more fully when he is speaking and sharing his materials. I'll pass it over to Chris.
Thank you very much, Heather. And thank you, in fact, for putting all of this together on your great efforts. And to everybody at the Reno Film. And thanks also to Ollie for providing this great space for us, where we can make such good use of technology. Thanks to all of you for coming and enjoying this with us today. And thanks to all of you panelists. I think this will be a really interesting discussion of a piece of music that none of us have heard yet, but it's going to be something we will be able to hear in about 3 months. And it takes on such interesting and big themes that we decided we will spend some time actually digging into those themes and how they relate to us and our community and to the globe, as a matter of fact. So let's start at the beginning. Laura, I'll turn it over to you. Talk about the impetus of this. Where did this project begin and how did Jimmy's name come into it?
Absolutely. One of the things that I find most fascinating about being a conductor and a music director is having the platform to commission new works of music. It is something that I find to be absolutely incredible. And why is that? It's because art is really a mirror from which we can reflect on our lives and ourselves. And so what better way to grapple with issues that are facing us now than to ask artists of our time to create art about it? In this case, you know, the topic of the interaction between human beings and the natural environment, there isn't a person on the globe that doesn't find that topic to be relevant in some way, you know? So it's of broad interest. It is certainly a topic of more and more conversation in our global dialogue these days. And I thought it would be really fascinating to ask an artist to write something about that. Now, at the same time, the other reason that I love to commission is because of the power of collaborations. When you collaborate with different institutions in your community, you really amplify the work of art that you can create. You make something that is bigger and better and that impacts, you know, a greater audience. So in this case, we are so fortunate to have the Nevada Museum of Art right here in our community. The fact that they have an international reputation for the Center of Art and the Environment, and for a photographic collection of art that they have been gaining, you know, working on over time, called Altered Landscape. It just seemed to me that this would be the perfect kind of impetus to take the photographs from this collection that deal with exactly the topic of how human beings interact with the natural environment, and then ask a composer to write, you know, something about the photographs after looking at them. Now, Jimmy, you asked, how did Jimmy come into this? You know, it's always really tricky when you pick a topic to commission about. It's scary to pick a composer. You have to find the right person, somebody who's going to resonate with the topic and write something really incredible. Also, I need somebody who's going to resonate with you, and somebody who's going to write something that is going to speak to you and work for you when you hear it. So that I really care about how it's going to be received. And it has to be a composer who is just plain brilliant at what he does and who can engage the musicians. So Jimmy is somebody that I have followed over time. I did his piece, I did a world premiere of his piece, Guardian of the Horizon, I worked on it in Detroit with a small chamber orchestra. And, I remember calling him up and I was like, who are you? Because this piece is amazing. And why don't I know you? I got to know him that way. And just as we got closer and closer to this topic and I started talking to him, I realized he was absolutely, without a doubt, the perfect person for this project.
So Jimmy, first, congratulations on the symphony. I think I'm speaking for just about everybody here when I say we're really, really anxious to hear it. And by the way, we are going to have a little bit of a sneak peek at the symphony, just a little segment of it a little bit later on. But first, Jimmy, you are presented with this idea from Laura, this sort of general theme. What's your next step? What do you start investigating?
Well, since the point of departure was the Altered Landscape collection, I mean, the next step was clearly delving into the collection and trying to understand its genesis, its spirit, and also starting to think about how to make music based on it. But not only, the photographs are marvelous works of art that can exist by themselves. They do not need music in that sense. So what I was trying to bring to the table was a different layer of, let's say, the temporal aspect to these pictures, and in that sense, that's when my mind went into how do I create a narrative that can engage the audience over time, because a symphony will, take place over time, and it has to take us on a journey. And that was precisely what the collection was doing to me. And I started to kind of sense different aspects that I grouped into 4 movements. And those 4 movements have an arch. And we will go today in detail into what the first movement is, but each movement actually encapsulates a different idea, and there are a set of photographs that we have carefully selected that kind of reflect that those concepts that are contained within each movement. So that was actually the greatest challenge for sure. But indeed, the marrying 2 works of 2 different artistic genres, such as photography and music, you want to augment, you don't want to just either create a soundtrack. You want to create a musical piece that can stand on its own, but that can also augment the message that the photographs had within them already.
So you're creating a narrative. What kind of narrative can you create in the course of a piece of instrumental music?
Well, in this particular case, the thing that struck me the most was how subtle the presence of humans in some of the pictures were. You could only see traces, like a hairline of a pipeline in an otherwise pristine landscape. And then sometimes it's in your face, you just see rubber and concrete. So then what was clear to me is that this was telling us a story of how us human beings have impacted our planet, and how we actually do it in different ways, and we have done it in different ways over time, because that is also a collection that starts all the way back in the late 1800s and goes until our day. So that's when I started my research about a period called the Great Acceleration, and that is, what basically inspired the first movement. And the Great Acceleration, we will go into detail that later, but that understood as by 2 writers, Peter Engelke and John Robert McNeill, have published a book under the same name. And I found that very fascinating, because they are speaking about a period of time that starts around the end of World War II and continues until our day, of an incredible increase of socioeconomic and earth system trends. Socioeconomic talking about, let's say, urban population or transportation, primary energy use, and the earth system trends like carbon dioxide emissions, tropical forest loss. So what we are seeing is that all these trends that before, were increasing at a very, very incremental level, then all of a sudden they took a spike. And those are very clear in some of the graphs that I studied and collected. So that is when, but also that gave me a strong narrative for me to create a piece that has an arch. And that, acceleration is by in and of itself a very interesting word in music, and the concept that we can create a piece that lasts 14 minutes that adds in intensity throughout all of it. It's just it was a great challenge, but also it had the potential to be very gripping.
This does not qualify as a piece of program music per se. That is to say, this particular bit of the music does not correspond to a historical event or to a historical character. It's not a narrative in that sense.
No, it is not. And I've also been very careful not to associate either movements or specific parts of the piece strictly into this or that photograph, because I feel that will be very limiting. I mean, and it has been done before, famously by Mussorgsky on Pictures and an Exhibition. And I wanted a different approach. I wanted something that was inspired by the collection at large, and hence I had to create my own narrative.
So let's move to the collection at large, and I'll bring you in, Bill. You are the director of the Center for Art and Environment at the Nevada Museum of Art. In fact, I think you were the founding director, right? And were involved in the actual planning of the center. What is the center? And I think many of us have seen works from the Altered Landscape collection, but give us a little overview of what we're talking about.
Thanks, Chris. And
sure.
Laura, thank you and Jimmy for setting this up so nicely. So the Nevada Museum of Art is 90 years old. It's the oldest and largest nonprofit arts organization in the state. And the people who started it, one was, in fact, a teacher at UNR, a classics professor, who took to climbing Mount Rose every winter to measure the water content of snow. That was his excuse. He actually was training to be a polar explorer. But he told the university president when he said, "Why are you doing this?" He said, "Well, I'm helping the farmers in Fallon figure out how much water they're going to have for irrigation the following spring after I climb the mountain." And so he invents a method we still more or less use today. It's used around the world. He forms an important climate data set, or people form it around that kind of activity. And he starts the Nevada Museum of Art with his best friend, who's a book collector. And that museum got run by members of the Latimer Art Club, who were plein air painters who went out into nature and made paintings and prints and drawings of what they saw in front of them. So it was really just documenting, in a sense, documenting nature, but through an aesthetic medium, through art.
We've seen many of those works on exhibit at the museum recently.
Exactly so. And so it was really, really happy for us to put those, to bring the Latimer Art Club up back into the house, so to speak, and say, look, these are the people who really got us started. So you've heard the term great acceleration. I will probably talk more about that, I suppose, later. You're going to talk about Paul Crutzen at all? You're going to talk about Anthropocene or any of that stuff?
We probably will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so the Nevada Museum of Art is going to build a new building this is like 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, in our current location. And they really want to figure out what's a signature collection that we can have that no one else has. What can we do that no one else has done? And they decide, two people, Peter Poole, who was on our board, who was our board chair at the time, and Peter Goen, who's a professor of photography at UNR. They sit down and say, well, let's collect photography because, one, we can afford it, right? And because all the good paintings of the Sierra Nevada are in the Crocker Art Museum, or they're in the Met, or they're wherever they are, but they aren't in Reno. So we don't have access to them. We can't afford to buy them. So therefore, let's concentrate on photography. And furthermore, let's concentrate on the photography of our time, right? So there was a motion afoot in America that started in the 1960s that was in reaction to Ansel Adams. So Ansel Adams and Elliot Porter was another famous photographer. Ansel Adams had an aesthetic that said he was going to document nature as Eden. There was a state of being to which we aspire. So it's kind of nature without a lot of traces of human beings in it. So if you look at those really famous photographs of the Sierra Nevada, you see these beautiful granite cliffs and you see the snow on high, and you don't see suburbs. There were artists who were noticing the fact that you could not escape the human footprint anymore. So you could live in Bishop, if you're in the middle of a town that was expanding. You could live in Reno, you were in the middle of a town that was growing like crazy. So they realized, what do we do to photograph what is? So let's accept the fact that people are everywhere in nature, that we're part of nature, and we're kind of trashing nature. So these are photographs of suburbs and warehouses and housing developments and railroad tracks and industry alive and well post World War II. World War II, we invented this amazing engine to prosecute the war. Dwight Eisenhower called the military industrial complex. Do you know the story of the guy who walked in front of a big radar unit with a chocolate bar in his pocket? So this is after the war, it's 1950s, and he works for a company called Raytheon, and they build radar installations. And he's testing a really powerful new radar unit, and he walks in front of a radar unit the beam is on, right? And he's got a chocolate bar in his pocket. When he gets over to the other side, he realizes he's got a sticky mess in his pocket. The chocolate bar has melted. That's the invention of the Amana radar range, right? So that's an example, a simple example of how the military industrial complex moves from prosecuting the war to prosecuting consumerism. And that consumerism is in large part responsible for the tremendous, graphs that we'll see, the growth in the chemical traces around the planet. So the photographers are looking at all that, and they don't know exactly what the mechanisms are, but they start to photograph what's around them. And it's not Ansel Adams, it's a guy named Robert Adams. So these guys became known as the new topographers. That was the beginning of the altered landscape photography collection for us. So we start collecting photographs from the 60s that show the human footprint around the planet. The center studies, and if we can have the purple slide, please. The center studies, creative human interactions between natural built and virtual environments. And I'll end with this. This is a graph by Jerry Schubel, who's a marine biologist who was the head of the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach. And Jerry is, he gets hired by the National Academy of Sciences to study why field stations, science stations at universities around the country, why their funding is slipping. What's going on? They're doing good science, they're producing tremendous science, and they're doing wonderful work. And this is my friends at the UC Berkeley Sachin Creek Field Station gave us this. And Jerry said, what you're doing is you're doing good science. So you're doing this part down here really good. You're collecting data and you're turning into knowledge through papers and conferences and the scientific community, but you're not affecting policy and politics up at the top. You're not getting across that gap. He said, that's a sparsely, inhabited domain, that gap. What's there are the arts and humanities. And if you guys can find a way to get the arts and humanities to tell your story, by helping people to care about your place, then you have a chance of affecting policy and politics. You can remain scientists, you don't have to tell the stories, but you can find people who will tell those stories for you. So the Altered Landscape Collection is 3,000 photographs that tell that story of how we have changed the planet. And that's what Jimmy plundered quite profitably by looking through all these photographs and pulling these things out and saying, these are the things that are iconic for me in this process, and finding hope while he's doing so. I'm going to stop here.
No, that's good. You mentioned the origin as sort of the anti-Ansel Adams approach. Would you say that the Altered Landscape Collection has a perspective, takes a point of view in terms of the environment?
Oh, Chris, my director's going to hate you for asking that question.
That's why I asked.
So, when we first started the Center for Art and Environment, we said, don't ever use the word environmentalism, because people immediately latch on that. And it's hard for them to think about anything else, good or bad or whatever it is, right? It's hard to think about anything else. So that's why it's the Center for Art and Environment. Things are now at a point where people are comfortable enough with the facts at hand that we can say, yeah, we actually have a lot of work that's about environmentalism, you bet. We've been called an activist archive, not because we promote a particular political agenda, but because we support projects by artists around the world. And we have 1.5 million items representing 1,500 artists working on all 7 continents. And it's a very global thing, right? We support those artists who want to go out and do projects before they do them often, right? So we're not just catching up to what's been done in the arts community, but we're actively supporting projects that go to the South Pole and measure air pollution, at the station there. I mean, these are amazing projects, and they're really wonderful things. And sometimes the photographs are, as Jimmy well knows, as Laura well knows, they're really disturbing. And Chris, from, they're sometimes ugly and horrifying, and they're sometimes beautiful and heartbreaking. And so you have this enormous emotional range in the collection that really, I think, finds full flavor in music and poetry and other disciplines.
So we're talking about the Altered Landscape collection, and Jimmy, your particular perspective coming out of looking at some of those works, you latched onto this idea of the great acceleration. Can we expand on that a little bit? And Bill, I'd also like your perspective on this, because I believe I heard from you that you have had interactions with people that came up with the concept. But Jimmy, let's hear from you first about the great acceleration. And you mentioned how you turned it into a piece of music, but your understanding of what it is.
Yes. So I have prepared a few slides to illustrate, my thought process. So if we have them ready, I will ask you to show page 1. Yes, that's correct. So these are some graphs that I gathered from the International Geosphere Biosphere program. And these are data basically reflected into very, very clearly, very neatly, put together graphs. Now this one goes from 1750 until 2010. The data starts at 2010. But what you can see clearly is that, these are the Earth system trends that we were talking about first. You can see that there's a spike at around 1940, 1950. There is a clear sharp turn upwards. Now, if you go to the second page, page number 2, then you will see that that is even more apparent in the socioeconomic trends. And that is not surprising because, these are directly a result of the increased human activity and the increased technology that led to this point. Now, these two were really interesting to me because I thought, well, I need to create something that can musically depict this trajectory, this hyperbole in a way. So what I did is first I started to try to play with graphs myself, just to try to illustrate with a pencil drawing of what kind of shape will be derived from this. This is not very scientific, but this is just inspiration. This is page 3. And this is just me trying to kind of visually make a connection between those graphs and what I think the intensity in the music will be, the overall arch in that composition. If we go to number 4, then I'm trying to do now a more clear correlation between the graphs that we saw first and some musical values. Now here, we have letter A and letter B. Now the one on the top, both go from, in the left, from 1945 to 2010. I didn't write that down, but that's where they end. And then on the vertical, letter A goes, it's measured in beats per minute. And letter B, it's measured in hertz. So what I was trying to, first, beats per minute basically is the intensity in tempo, the rhythmic intensity. And then hertz, it just means, going from low to high, basically, in musical terms. Now, these are just my first ideas, that I was trying to, or how I can actually translate those graphs into musical ideas. So more concretely now on page 5, this is more or less my first attempt at marrying those my personal graphs with the actual graphs and doing some measurements. Now, obviously, I had to go a little more into detail, and this took a week or two, and with the help of some friends who know Excel really, really well, I was able to collect the data and produce the graph that is on page 6, actually. And that is much more clearly depicted from 1945 and 2010. And I have both trends, the socioeconomic, which is more steep, and the Earth trend. Reflected in hertz, going from 0 to 4,500. And then in the next graph, yes, that one, that is the same concept, but translated into beats per minute. So here I have a more concrete way of how I can manipulate gradually, because the hardest challenge, I think, in a piece like this is how do you sustain the steady growth of the piece from the beginning until the very end without losing control of time, because it's an extended piece, so you need to keep your markers in place. One thing I just want to explain for those who are not very familiar with, what hertz are, for example, I want to go to page 8, and we don't need to analyze in detail this page, but this is just basically a comparison of a piano keyboard and their equivalent in hertz. So at the very left, we have the note A, which is the lowest note of the piano, right? And that is 27.5 hertz. And then at the very right, at the end, we find high C, which is 4186 hertz. And so basically the symphony orchestra is very much, it is more or less aligned with this. The lowest possible notes by a symphony orchestra are generally B flat, so 29 hertz. So I had all this spectrum to play with when writing the piece. When we go to page 9, now this is a more clear, basically the Excel graphs that I was talking about, but this is myself getting organized here. On the left, you have the time, so from 0 seconds to 14, down there, which is the duration of the piece. Then the next column is a year, and the next column is the beats per minute. And the two columns to the right are just for me to have an idea. They are the beats per minute divided by 2 and divided by 4. It is just for me to be, tempo markings, for them to be practical. They shouldn't really exceed 180, 200. After that, it just becomes impractical. So this is basically a progression of how I was planning the rhythmic intensity so that I could ensure that I was not going ahead of myself. I was holding the reins of the piece, but also I was continuously making it more intense rhythmically. So as you can see, for example, at minute 6, I went already from 55 beats per minute to 145. And then by the end, by minute 14, I have reached 180, which is in reality, if we go strictly from the left column, we start at 716. But to make it, we have ways, composer, we have ways of doing metric modulation so that we can communicate more effectively the tempo changes to the orchestra without making them crazy. We have to do the calculations. We don't ask the musicians to do the calculations. And then the very last page, that is more or less the grand plan that I devised in terms of the whole symphony. And there you see, the first movement is a single section, a single block of 14 minutes. But then the others, I already subdivided. But we're not going into detail that because those are not the subject of today's talk. But I want to call your attention to the section below that talks about the Schumann resonance peaks. And why is that important? Because the Schumann resonance is a fascinating phenomenon that I only got familiar with around the same time that I discovered what the Anthropocene and the Great Acceleration were. And basically they are resonances, global electromagnetic resonances that are generated by lightning discharges in between the surface of the Earth and the ionosphere. And they peak, meaning that they are stronger at certain frequencies. And those frequencies, when you subdivide them, you end up with a scale, basically. And that Schumann resonance scale, that's what I'm calling it. It has been the basis for this piece. And now to add another layer of complexity, some of them align with brain waves. And this has been also fascinating to me because it gave me this poetic way of marrying science with a concept that, us humans actually can be aligned with, the vibrations of the Schumann resonances, basically. And it is a beautiful way of understanding how humans and Earth actually can vibrate in tandem. And that is actually the concept behind the very last movement. But in any case, I wanted to give you an overview of what my thought process for this piece was. Yeah.
And you could, just by hearing Jimmy talk about this, you get a sense of why he's the perfect person. And talk about finding a composer who would invest in this, and really take on this, embrace this whole topic. I just blows my mind. I have to say, when I first saw the page with all of the intensifications of the tempos and, through those 14 minutes, I didn't sleep that night. I was like, wow, I have to hit these tempos so exactly. So it's a great responsibility to, perform that with this much research behind it. I'm usually when I'm cooking, I'm like, you throw a little of this and that, and I feel like I have to be much more exacting here.
So a lot of science and a lot of math and a lot of thought have gone into this. Shall we hear a little bit of the musical result?
Yeah.
Because we won't have a chance to hear the entire symphony for a few months yet, for about 3 months. But the Reno Phil has recorded some excerpts from the symphony, and we have an excerpt from the first movement. So, Virginia? So the orchestra has some work to do.
Very, very challenging piece. It's going to be formidable. And it was wonderful in January, just the last time I was here, to have the chance to actually read through the piece and then to record these excerpts.
Oh, what portion of the movement did we just hear, Jimmy? Where did that little excerpt fall within that 14-minute span that you were talking about?
Do you remember the exact spot, Laura?
Letter J.
Yeah.
About halfway?
Approximately.
So I guess
Perhaps, yes.
yeah,
yes,
yeah,
I would
think
say
about
so.
halfway.
Yeah.
So let's expand for at least a couple of minutes on this idea of the great acceleration, not just as it applies to music, but as it applies to life. Bill, I wanted to get back to you because you had mentioned that you have had interactions with the people who came up with this concept in the first place.
Yeah, so the main guy I worked with was Will Steffen at Australia National University in Canberra. And he's a colleague of Paul Kreutzen, one of the guys who kicked off this entire discussion of are we in a new geologic era or epoch, the Anthropocene and so forth. So, so the Great Acceleration, I mean, Anthropocene aside, the Great Acceleration, you can just see the chemical traces clearly in the ocean, in the atmosphere, in the soils, in ice cores. I mean, we have in the museum coming to us a reliquary of an art project that contains a record of 68,000 years of Antarctic ice, which is a climate record. And you can trace those changes in that climate record in those samples of water. So that was done by an artist. And another thing, I mean, Jimmy, you're blowing my mind. I mean, this is great, man, because so many artists many scientists play instruments. Often it's the piano or the violin, but they play instruments. And they have the idea that, that music can represent certain kinds of things. And so one thing you can do when data sets get really big, if you want to measure the, the cubic yards of cement, which actually affects the air that we breathe, right, in terms of chemical composition of it. If you want to measure that, you're dealing with gazillions of, numbers that have to be crunched. You can sonify those numbers. You can assign them tempo, and you can assign them, frequency and so forth. And you can actually hear the patterns and the changes. But that's just, I want to say that's just pure sound. It's not music. So to have Jimmy, to have you take you're up here, I know, I'm standing on the screen. So if I look like I'm schizophrenic, it's, so to actually have him take this and transform it, it is the difference between making a picture that is simply a picture of something, and then making a picture that represents something through metaphor. That's a tertiary level transformation in art talk. That's a whole different kind of activity. So that's Jimmy. Holy cow, man! I can't wait. Yeah, geez. So again, the great acceleration. It's all around us. When I talk to Will Stephan, I'm sitting in his office at the University in Canberra, and we were talking about tipping points, right? And he said, "Yeah, I think we've probably gone over 3 or 4 of the 7 kind of common tipping points that we talk about." And I said, "How as a scientist do you cope with this? How do you deal with it?" And he pulls open his drawer and he pulls out a little bottle, and he says, shakes it. And he says, "Antidepressants." And he puts the bottle back in the drawer and closes the drawer. I mean, so the great acceleration, there's an awful lot of momentum in the system with all these different changes that we've created. And so it's really important in the face of that, because that's a looming wall. It's really important to maintain hope. I mean, he said the most dangerous thing of all is the loss of hope. And so, if we lose that, we're genuinely in trouble. There's no coming back from that. So we have to have science. We have to have art to even help us understand the science. And both art and science are going to say, there are possible ways through this. And how do we maintain heart? And how do you reduce your carbon footprint? So, yeah. So again, the alternate landscape, I mean, that's tangible proof. It's a photographic record of these changes. And it's kind of a parallel course to what the scientists would produce.
Speaking of scientists, we have a couple of panelists we haven't heard from yet. So Steph and Catherine, I'm going to have you grab your microphones. I'll start with you, Steph. You are the Nevada State Climatologist. Tell us a little bit about the work that you do and the kind of information, the kind of data that you work with.
Okay, so in Nevada, in most states, actually, the state climatologist is the state climate resource. In Nevada, I perhaps not entirely unusual, but a little bit unusual in that this is one of many hats that I wear. I'm also a professor at UNR. So the kind of data we work with, I say we, I have an office that is composed of me and students. So I want to talk about hope for the future. How we're running the office. So we work both with data collected at weather stations, and probably some of you have versions of these in your backyard. But of course, we've been measuring weather for a long time, in particular since World War II. World War II was actually a big impetus for collecting increased weather information. We had new technology, but also more folks back from the war and on the GI Bill and working in jobs that put them in a place to collect weather data. So we work with that, but also with the output from climate models. So these are extensive mathematical models that let us test what the future might be like under different conditions. And other scientists then take these results and put them into models to understand ecosystem change, impacts on people in cities, health effects, hydrologic effects, so water supply. And just like Church was worried about how much water would be available for the farmers in Fallon, this is one of my concerns every year this time of every year as well.
And you've actually created a report called you and many other collaborators have created a report called Climate Change Impacts in Nevada. Have you seen what we're talking about in terms of the great acceleration and the cascading effects of human interaction with, I'll put it politely, human interaction with the environment?
Well, so, we do see, particularly in the cities, changes in temperature, particularly increasing in the last few decades. But so just like I think you're saying, we see human impacts differently expressed in photographs in the altered landscape collection. We also see very different patterns and causes of these climate changes in Nevada. In Reno and in Las Vegas in particular, in our cities, we know there's the impact of overall climate change. We also see signatures of the growth of the city impacting climate. In both of these cities, we see them warming much more than the area around the city. And I think Catherine has some pictures showing just how much the city has grown. And when the cities are larger, they tend to warm up. And so we actually see this interaction. If we were to think back to, say, the 1950s, even in the summer, nighttime lows in Reno were typically much cooler than today, 40s, 50s at night. And today, I mean, I think last year there were 28 days between June and August when the nighttime temperature didn't drop below 65. And that's often a threshold where we think about people starting to then use some sort of cooling at night, because 65 at night is pretty warm, especially if it's been 90, 95, 100 during the day. And so that this is starting to feed back on itself, right? Of course, to cool your house, you either need more water, which is typically in short supply here in Nevada, or you need electricity, or you need both. So we're starting to see this twining together of the changes that have been caused by humans through multiple avenues, but also that dealing with those changes is starting to take more resources as well.
And you actually look at this information from various perspectives, but then you apply it to areas like tourism, like recreation, like the environment, like public health and things like that. All of this enters into your sort of purview.
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
Obviously, I don't make decisions in any of those areas, and that's probably for the best, right? You know, if I were in charge of tourism, no one would get to do anything but go camping. So,
but you do look for potential impacts in those
right?
areas.
Well, often what I'm doing is collaborating with others who have more knowledge of that area, because there are often in any field these things that aren't obvious that you don't think about unless you're wrapped up in it. So it would be unfortunate for me to be going and taking a look at the impacts on tourism or ranching or farming, because I'm not in hospitality and I don't farm or ranch. And to find out what the impacts are, I need to talk to people who are engaged in that. And sort of that middle spot on the graph where science is engaging with policy,
Right.
it is a two-way street. Policy has to, and decision-making has to inform the science that's necessary. And in an ideal world, then science provides information that allows for a better decision.
What is the prognosis looking like for the next, say, decade or 2 or 3?
So I will say over 1 or 2 decades, we tend not to make predictions. This is the black hole of weather and climate forecasting. All the tools that work for weather start to lose skill, because all of those tools really depend on what is it like right now. Okay? And as we move to a decade or so, well, the atmosphere doesn't remember back that long. When we get to 20 or 30 years out, we can start thinking about or start looking at the output from models, right? If we look at the next 10 years, they generally are about like now, maybe a little warmer, maybe a little wetter, but honestly kind of a mess. And it's difficult to pull apart for lots of good reasons that scientists know and expect. And so we generally say, for the most part, let's not look at that, right? Once we get out to 30 years, we do start seeing warmer overall. And in particular, more of those really warm days, fewer of the really cold days. And actually, we've been seeing in the models for some time now, something that we're all kind of experiencing right now, really wet followed by really dry. Now, this is not that unusual for Nevada to start with, but we expect to see sort of an amplification of that pattern of all the snow, then no snow, then all the snow. And of course, it's more convenient for all of us if it comes in little bits, right? So these are the two things that are really driving what we see going forward, right? Of course, if it's warmer and precipitation is, I'm not going to say more erratic, but more extreme and maybe a little more volatile, then it is easier to go back and forth between drought and flooding, or to have droughts with floods in the middle, right? Something we saw last summer in Las Vegas, right? Flash floods during the middle of a very significant drought. And with this can also come changes in wildfire. So not necessarily full-on increase, but an expansion of the fire season, whether that's later in the fall or earlier in the spring, outside of the time window we normally think about it, whether some of those fires are larger, right, or just more frequent.
Let's bring in a historical perspective as well from Catherine, from the Nevada Historical Society, which has been around for what, close to 120 years now, something like that.
Founded in 1914 or 1904, excuse me. So, yeah.
And has been documenting all sorts of areas of Nevada history, including, speaking of the Altered Landscape collection, a photographic collection that extends into the hundreds of thousands now, right?
Correct, yes. Yes.
Do you see from your perspective physical evidence, sociological evidence of what we are calling the Great Acceleration?
Well, yes, I do. And I think from a cultural standpoint, sort of my interest as a academic and also as somebody who is interested in preserving our history and our cultural heritage tend to intersect in this very nice thing, because in my hat as a cultural geographer, I study the impact of tourism on our cultural heritage. So, and that is looking at the physical landscapes, buildings, as well as the impact on what it does to us as people. I do have an interesting slide, the one of the growth of Reno. So just, I thought, because we are talking about actually the physical expansion of the physical landscape. And I think this, if you could you blow that up a little bit? So basically I found a couple of aerial photographs that are almost at the same scale from Reno in 1956 and Reno in 1999 with a couple of areas circled. And I think one thing that people do forget about the Truckee Meadows is that we were pretty agrarian at one point. And one thing that happens with this great acceleration or the Anthropocene or with economic development and prosperity is the expansion of the built landscape into the environmental landscape. Basically, we are expanding into areas that were not developed. So these things are interesting because we can look at the historic record at the Nevada Historical Society. So I was looking around a little bit when I was looking at these slides, looking at things, and like you all might remember, the 1970s, people sort of got this environmental awareness that was happening, and that really was true in a lot of our government reports. So when you're talking about this data compared to going into policy, that was very obvious when you would read the historic accounts of the history of Nevada, but also the kind of reports that our state agencies were putting out. All of a sudden in the 70s, they were really looking at the land use, the water, what percent of our economy was gaming, was agriculture, other kinds of industry and employment. And also remember with the expansion, at least here, one of the things that during that time that really helped influence our physical landscape and our impact on the landscape was what was happening economically, the surge from World War II. Even though there was a recession in the 70s, 80s, we did expand here. We were growing while other states weren't. And a lot of that was due to mining as well as our gaming industry. And remember that back in the 50s, and you can look on that, we really didn't have any major roads or infrastructure, but I-80 came in, 395 came in, and those transportation corridors allowed the expansion of people moving out of the city center into more desirable areas where, you have the, nature, and also in some areas that had more affordable housing. So there's a combination of things that you're seeing here in just what and why we expanded here in the Truckee Meadows. And that is, if you want to get the other slide of the downtown Reno, again, same period. One of the issues is that there's also this movement out of the center of the city. The businesses move as in particular gaming took over. So you can see on the slide Reno circa 1955. It's some combination of businesses and gaming, and so you would have people coming to the downtown center business district to live their daily lives. But then in the around 2000, it's fairly clear that what people are doing are enjoying our gaming and entertainment. So that has changed the built environment and also how we as people interact with these built environments, with cultural institutions, businesses, things like that, that have moved into different locations. So as somebody who studies the history and is interested in the history here in Reno, I think these couple of slides just really kind of highlight what you guys are really examining in the piece, in this great symphony and not symphony, is it a symphony?
Mhm.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Symphony, as well as what's happening in the art and environment, but I've just kind of brought it back to here as a local perspective.
Some of us, I won't speak for anyone else, but some of us are old enough to remember when the southernmost part of Reno was a thing called Park Lane Mall on Plum Lane. And after that, heading south, there was farms and open space. Then Meadowood Mall became the southernmost part of town. And I guess it's just me. I'm old enough to still think of Meadowood Mall as being the south part of town, and it really isn't anymore. Are we seeing impacts in terms of, we rely so heavily on the Truckee River, for instance, and we rely so heavily on accumulated snowpacks when we get them. Are we reaching a tipping point yet? Are we still decades away from that in terms of our capacity to just live comfortably in our area? I'll throw this open to anybody who has an answer. Yeah, think about that one for a minute.
I guess I'm going to throw a question back to you. What do you mean live comfortably?
That's a good question. Not having to endure major crises in terms of drought, in terms of water availability, in terms of blackouts, in terms of simply getting on with our day-to-day lives and being able safely to ignore the environment around us. I know I'm saying that in a deliberately provocative way.
Well, I would say it probably depends very much who you are. If you, let's say this first, water supplies in this area, it's an area that's always experienced drought. Also, the region has water managers who more or less know what they're doing, right? As much as any of us do. And so planning for drought is something that people do here. particularly water suppliers. If you're in the Reno area, last year we were well into a pretty significant drought, and the only real requests you were getting were routine conservation because there was, sufficient water. I was looking at the reservoir report for the Truckee River just this morning, and some of the reservoirs are lower than they would normally be at this time of year, but they're not dry. There's water in those, and there is water in the snowpack right now that is about where we would expect it to be for this time of year. But if you are there are some farmers and ranchers whose maybe have a lower priority water right, who wonder, is this the year where I might not get as much water as I need? And there are other people whose livelihood relies on the climate, who are much more directly impacted, and who will feel those impacts first. We also know that there are socioeconomic differences in who feels impacts when. If you have a home with air conditioning in a lovely part of town that has lush vegetation, you will not be as impacted as someone who lives in a hotter part of the city who doesn't have air conditioning, who relies on Reno public transportation to get to and from work. So I would say that this isn't a simple question, and in many cases, the answer varies.
Can art take a perspective on this? Can art provide insight on questions like this?
So that, the artists are sometimes canaries. And in fact, there is an art project called the Canary Project that deals with exactly what you're talking about. So, the future is always distributed unequally. So what we see are more and more projects by artists around the world dealing with environmental justice issues than simply documenting the fact that glaciers are disappearing in the Andes. What they're thinking about is, what does that mean to the city of Santiago? And if you're a wealthy person in Chile and you have the ability to live in the upper part of town with lots of vegetation, you're going to feel it one way. If you're living in the lower part of the city, which typically is, more economically stressed, you're going to be really thirsty and really hungry, and your eyes are going to hurt from what's in the air. I mean, it's, more than if you're literally up above it. So you see it in the art projects. And you can see David Walker, my director, asked me a couple of days ago, he said, because what I've been talking about is this stance now that drifts a little bit more in the art community towards environmentalism that's actually more overt. He said, Bill, you have 175 separate archives comprising the archive collection in the center. And you've talked about some of them are like observers, right? There's people who take pictures of things or whatever. And then some people are activists, so they actually go out and go protest something that's going on, and they document that, and that's part of an art project. And then sometimes they're interventionists. And so, for instance, when the Harrisons came here, the legendary inventors of eco art in America, basically from UC San Diego, they come to the Sierra, and they're really concerned about species boiling off the top of the range because it's warming so much. And so they literally designed experimental test plots to see if there are kind of ensembles of plants that can be brought in, same genome, so you're not messing up the environment, to address that so that you can maintain water quality in the face of the fact that precipitation is now perhaps more rain than it was before. It's not as much snow and so forth. So you can see those kinds of active measures happening. And he said, I want to count. And we just made that count this morning. And we can just see, and we can see the archives that we're collecting over the last 12 years. You can see it becoming more and more interventionist and more activist and less simply being a casual observer. So you can see people getting worried.
I'll add too that with this project, it's not simply about, creating and performing the symphony and inspiring conversations like this. It is definitely about that. But we have a third collaborator beyond the NMA, and that is the Nature Conservancy. And what we are doing is enlisting a consortium of orchestras globally that are going to perform this work after we do the world premiere. And instead of those orchestras paying a commissioning fee back to the Rio Phil, we're asking them to donate that fee to the Nature Conservancy to actually impact on the fight against climate change. So it's our way of trying to actually, have a little bit of impact on people that are doing the actual work, to take care of our resources.
Turning it back to you, Jimmy, for one last word. We are really dealing with the first movement of your symphony today, the Great Acceleration. Would you call that, by the way, would you call that movement a dark vision of the present?
Well, it's more like confronting us with the present. But obviously, there's an emotion behind it. And I think there's a sense of urgency. So perhaps not dark in the sense that we are doomed, but trying to communicate that action needs to be taken. And that if none is taken, then perhaps we will be doomed.
I would say it's an anxious movement. It has just an air of need for action. It's an anxious feeling.
But returning to a theme that you shared, Bill, which is not to lose hope and try to remain optimistic. Jimmy, your overall theme for the symphony, you actually find your way to optimism at the end.
I did. I spoke about this with Laura, and I also felt, after visiting the exhibit with Bill and looking at the pictures, that there are some concepts that are not necessarily reflected within the exhibit itself and the collection, but Bill showed me some fascinating drawings of technologies that are being dreamed of even at this point in time, that can lead to the most incredibly creative solutions to find balance. And, those were very inspiring. So I basically created this arch from the anxiety and that we are going through and at the moment, but always aiming at a day that we will be able to find this balance, this equilibrium, this alignment. And that's why the title of the last movement is that. So it ends on a note of hope, and it definitely has, in the darkness actually is contained within the second movement called Stillness. And that one is the one that makes a not very indirect allusion to the pandemic, in fact, because that is the moment where we confront our fears, our pain, and where we are forced to think. We are forced to actually deal with our own thoughts. But it was very striking, especially during the pandemic, to see those images of large metropolises, stopped to a halt, empty highways. That was very striking, and I think that was an incredible metaphor that was right in front of our eyes of what was awaiting us. And so there is that arch, in fact, but the darkness is found in the second movement, the meditating, the reconstruction, the reckoning is in the third, and the hope is in the very last one.
We are going to be taking on those remaining three movements in a couple of future talks that are coming up in the next couple of months. So keep your eye open for those. We're going to toss it open to questions for you. But before I do that, I would like to thank you, Jimmy, Laura, Bill, Catherine, and Steph for taking part in this. This has been really great. Any questions from the assembled audience for any of our panelists? Yeah.
Quick question for the climatologist. If you had to identify one factor that you think is contributing most to change, would it be overpopulation? Because you're saying things are getting warmer in the cities. Would it be because there's more people there, because they're using more electricity? What you, one thing?
You know, it's not entirely clear what the one main contributor to, say, Reno's urban heat island is. We know there's a suite of things that lead to them. One is replacing vegetation with pavement. And of course, right, if we go for those darker pavements, that probably has a lot to do with it, but sand and concrete, right? So a lot of the Northern Nevada's natural area looks like concrete, so that might not be it. It can be waste heat, so from cars and electricity from houses, but we haven't actually done the study to say, okay, in Reno, what is the primary driver of the urban heat island?
I should also mention, along with our audience members, we have people watching on Zoom who can contribute questions as well. But I do see a question here from our live audience. So let's go to that first.
It seems that the arts are continually faced with this enormous issue of creating something new and celebrating what's been handed down to us from the past. How do you work that balance for this Reno film?
So you mean the balance between playing Beethoven and creating works like this?
Exactly.
You know, it's something that I think about a lot, and I feel like in the same way a museum will have an exhibit of classic, old, you know, fantastic art, and then they will be something of a gallery for a living artist. I really feel like as a steward of the orchestral canon, it is my responsibility to do both as well. So what I think is incredible, I mean, I've already, you know, in terms of why I love to commission, I think nothing about Beethoven teaches me about climate issues in this moment the way Jimmy can, because he's living in this moment. But there's another part to crafting a program, and that includes a work of Beethoven and a work, you know, by Jimmy López Bellido. And what happens is when you juxtapose old and new, you hear the old as new. You hear the old differently. And so when we experience art that's created now, it gives us insights not only into our own time, but into art that was created years and years prior.
Beethoven was new and radical back in the 1810s and 1820s, and we can recapture some of that, as you say.
Exactly.
Are there any questions from anybody watching on Zoom? You're welcome to unmute and chime in if you would like. Doesn't look like any more questions from our live audience.
Were there some in the chat? Oh, it was just somebody saying that this has been wonderful.
Okay.
Well, I have a comment that I want to
Sure,
add. And,
please.
And Steph, you know, you are a wonderful example of why the Jerry Schubel graph is kind of necessary. You're trained, and I'm hit me over the head if I do this wrong. You're trained to, as clearly as you can, as carefully as you can, examine facts, and to be very careful with what you have to say about what those facts might mean. You're careful for a lot of different reasons, one of which is to preserve the integrity of science. I mean, so far, okay? So politicians have often a need, in order for them to keep getting elected, to be emotional. And you're not trained to provide anything emotional necessarily to the, I mean, they can choose to interpret what you have to say emotionally, but I mean, that's not your job. To maintain the integrity of what you do, you've got to stay out of that business. It's a business of the arts and the humanities to be right in the middle of that mess and happily play within it. One of the reasons that, you know, if you go to the Nevada Museum of Art and you look at the Latimer show, and you look at all those wonderful landscapes painted, you know, in oil and watercolor in the, you know, early part of the 20th century. And then right next door, you look at land art, which is a contemporary expression of what artists do with land, right? The reason for that is that the world doesn't stay still, the culture doesn't stay still, we don't stay still, science doesn't stay still, things move, things change. And so more than 90% of all visual art created disappears within 100 years of its making. It goes away through fire, flood, insects, divorce, houses being moved, it just goes away. Thank God. If that much art didn't get destroyed, we wouldn't have any room to create anything new, and we'd be socially, So I think that balance is critical to the survival of our culture, not just our arts organizations, and critical to our audiences. So it's yeah, I love a great landscape painting by Bierstadt as much as anybody on the planet, but I also want to see that other stuff, so yeah. Anyway.
But so I do want to point out quickly that I would be doing a disservice to some of my scientist colleagues. There are scientists who are very engaged with pushing certain policy agendas, and that's okay for where they are. I am a public service scientist. That means that anybody in Nevada needs to be comfortable coming to ask me a question and know that I'll be straight with them to the best of my knowledge. So that is, right, I am perhaps more measured about this is what I know, this is what I don't know, this is what I think it means in this context than other scientists might be.
But you'd really rather go camping rather than.
True for so many of us. Yes.
I've been excited about this project since we first started talking about it, but after listening to this initial conversation today and seeing all the different pieces coming together, it's, I think, truly profound with, impact that can be applied everywhere in the world. I mean, everywhere. And, I think the graph, Jimmy, that you showed at the very beginning of the arc, of starting from data and, going to politics at the end, and then that piece where it comes together and the role that the arts can play in translating, helping to translate data into, to emotion, and I think to some extent, as well as, communicate to a very broad audience is so powerful. I just hope that we can really blast this work and take the piece, which I'm sure can apply to any place in the world with all different kinds of problems, whether it's, in the Amazon or in Siberia and encourage other communities to not only play the music, but to engage the community. And, I'd love to see, a house full of people listening to all of this. And, but I can just see other museums collaborating to, bring their own, their own environment and pieces together. It's just, I'm just sort of blown away, really. I'm so excited about this. It's, I just hope we really can make sure to communicate it really, really, really widely and loudly.
Yeah, it's thank you, Dina, for your excitement and for all your help in all of the early stages as a board member. She's been helping us, put all this together. But, that's exactly the potential of the impact of this is really quite large. And it just feels so worthwhile to really, put this out there. And so we have made that part of it like a systematic process. And we have enlisted a collaborator, Scott Faulkner, who many of you know. He used to run the chamber orchestra. He knows orchestras all over the place, literally globally. And he has been in touch with administrators. He just recently sent out over 100 different packets to orchestras that had already expressed interest. And we have some large orchestras that are actually, like really, really about to jump on. So it is very exciting. We also, I did a discussion in front of some European orchestras, so we're putting it out there. It's something that, we're hoping will be performed over the next couple of years. But even if it's in 3 years. We just want it to have that sort of ripple effect and just keep going and inspiring conversations and building awareness and all of that.
Not only provoking discussions in all of these many places, but how gratifying it must be for a contemporary composer to be looking at the prospect of seeing dozens and dozens potentially of performances of a new piece. How does that feel, Jimmy?
No, absolutely. I mean, that is a rarity in the contemporary music world. Composers, for the most part, are resigned to listening to their piece once and then not being played again after the first performance. But, you know, the continuity of a work is important. And I'm so happy to see that the arena field is really committed to making this happen, because I think, you know, we, artists and arts organizations, museums, we can choose to use our platform for the greater good, or we can just, you know, ignore that and just play music that is purely abstract. That's also fine. But every now and then, I think it is important to use that soapbox that we have and to communicate messages that are important. And I think this one is one of the most urgent, pressing things that we have to face. And so the fact that we are, you know, head on just dealing with it and creating a discussion around it, I think that's really commendable. And it's gratifying, very gratifying as an artist to be involved in a piece that can spur discussion, and at the same time, hopefully that emotion that the audience can feel can be turned into action.
I think that's a perfect spot at which to end our conversation today. Again, thanks to all of you who came to listen in. Thanks to all of you on Zoom who also tuned in. Again, thanks to all of our panelists for a really great discussion. Thanks, Jimmy, for joining us remotely.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure having all of you taking part in this, and we hope to see you again in a few weeks when we'll take on the second movement of the Altered Landscape Symphony No. 3 by Jimmy Bellido. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you.